For decades, Joni Lamb was more than just a familiar face on Christian television. She was a woman who helped build an empire of faith, influence, and media from the ground up. To millions of viewers, she appeared calm, confident, graceful, and deeply spiritual. The kind of presence who could sit beneath the studio lights, look into the camera, and make people feel as if she were speaking directly into their homes. But behind that polished image, behind the warm smile and the perfectly arranged television set, Joni Lamb's life was far more complicated than many people ever realized. And when the news of her death broke, it did not simply bring grief. It brought questions. What really happened to Joni Lamb? What caused her death? Were the rumors true? How much of her public image matched the private life she was living? And why did her final years become surrounded by so much controversy, speculation, and heartbreak? Joni Lamb's story began long before the rumors, long before the headlines, and long before her name became attached to questions about wealth, family conflict, and tragedy. She first became widely known as the wife and ministry partner of Marcus Lamb, the founder of Daystar Television Network. Together, they helped turn a religious broadcasting dream into one of the most recognizable Christian television networks in the world. Daystar reached homes across America and far beyond, carrying sermons, worship programs, interviews, and faith-based talk shows to millions of viewers. For many Christians, Joni and Marcus Lamb represented a powerful image of partnership, husband and wife, ministry and media, faith and ambition all working together under one vision. But building something that large does not come without pressure. Behind every successful ministry broadcast, there were business decisions, financial responsibilities, public expectations, and private sacrifices. Joni was not just a woman sitting beside her husband. She became a major force within Daystar, a television host, a ministry leader, and a public personality in her own right. Her program, Joni Table Talk, became one of the network's signature shows, known for conversations about faith, healing, marriage, family, culture, and spiritual battles. Viewers saw her as compassionate and composed. She knew how to guide a conversation, how to listen, how to ask emotional questions, and how to create the feeling of intimacy on screen. But the more visible she became, the more people began to wonder what life was really like behind the camera. Then came one of the most painful turning points of her life. In 2021, Marcus Lamb died after complications related to COVID-19. His death shocked Daystar viewers and left Joni facing a future she had never publicly imagined. For decades, she and Marcus had been presented as a team. They had built the network together, prayed together, hosted together, and stood before the world as the faces of a Christian broadcasting dynasty. Suddenly, Joni was not only grieving the loss of her husband, she was also carrying the weight of a global ministry that had been deeply tied to both of their names. To many supporters, she appeared strong. She continued to show up. She continued to speak about faith. She continued to lead. But grief has a way of hiding in plain sight, especially when someone is expected to be strong for everyone else. After Marcus's death, Joni's public life entered a new and much more complicated chapter. She remained closely tied to Daystar and continued appearing on television, but her personal choices began attracting more attention. In 2023, she married Dr. Doug Weiss, a Christian counselor and media personality. For some viewers, this marriage looked like a new beginning after devastating loss. They saw a widow trying to rebuild her life, trying to find love again, and trying to move forward after years of shared ministry with Marcus. But for others, the marriage created discomfort, confusion, and even criticism. It also became part of a larger family conflict that would later become public and deeply painful. The Lamb family, once seen by many as a symbol of Christian unity, began appearing fractured. Reports and public statements suggested tension between Joni and some members of her family, especially involving her son Jonathan Lamb and his wife Susie. What had once been a private family matter became part of a public discussion about leadership, loyalty, inheritance, ministry control, and personal pain. For viewers who had watched Daystar for years, it was difficult to process. This was a network built on messages of healing, forgiveness, faith, and family restoration. Yet the family behind that network was now dealing with wounds that could not be easily hidden. And that is one reason Joni Lamb's final years became so heavily discussed. People were not only watching her as a religious broadcaster, they were watching a woman trying to navigate widowhood, remarriage, leadership, family division, public criticism, and declining health all at the same time. Every appearance, every statement, every absence from television seemed to invite more speculation. Some people defended her fiercely. Others questioned her decisions. Some saw her as a victim of unfair attacks. Others believed the controversies around Daystar deserved serious scrutiny. But almost everyone agreed on one thing. Something about Joni Lamb's final chapter felt heavy. Then came the health crisis that would lead to even more questions. Official reports stated that Joni Lamb had been dealing with serious health issues, and that her condition worsened after a back injury. Her health reportedly declined rapidly before her death. But because the public explanation did not include every medical detail, speculation began spreading almost immediately. Some online rumors claimed there was a hidden illness. Others suggested cancer. Some tried to connect her death to stress, family conflict, or the emotional burden of controversy. But the truth is more careful than the rumors. What has been confirmed is that Joni Lamb passed away at age 65 after serious health struggles, and that a back injury reportedly worsened her condition. What has not been clearly confirmed is every specific medical detail behind her death. That silence created a storm. In the world of celebrity, ministry, and online media, unanswered questions often become fuel for rumors. And because Joni Lamb was connected to faith, money, television, family drama, and public influence, the story spread even faster. People wanted to know everything: her cause of death, her lifestyle, her final days, her marriage, her family relationships, and her net worth. But the most tragic part is that behind all the curiosity was a real human life. Joni Lamb was not just a headline. She was a mother, a grandmother, a widow, a wife, a broadcaster, a ministry leader, and a woman who spent decades being watched by people who felt they knew her. Her lifestyle also became part of the public conversation. As Daystar grew into a powerful Christian media network, questions naturally followed about money, ministry finances, private wealth, and accountability. Joni Lamb's net worth has been estimated online in different ways, but many of those figures are speculative and not independently verified. What is clear is that she was connected to a large religious broadcasting organization with major influence, large operations, and a global audience. That connection made people curious about how she lived, what she owned, and how ministry money was managed. For supporters, those questions sometimes felt like attacks on a woman who had dedicated her life to Christian broadcasting. For critics, they were fair questions about transparency, power, and wealth inside religious media. But no matter which side people stood on, Joni Lamb's story cannot be reduced to one rumor, one headline, or one number. Her life was a mixture of success and sorrow, devotion and controversy, public faith and private struggle. She helped build something massive. She reached millions of people. She gave women in Christian television a stronger presence. She became a recognizable voice in homes around the world. Yet her final years were marked by a level of tension and uncertainty that made her death feel even more heartbreaking. The tragedy of Joni Lamb is not only that she died at 65, it is that she left behind a story filled with unresolved questions. Supporters remember her as a woman of faith who carried on after losing her husband. Critics remember the controversies surrounding Daystar and the family disputes that became public. Some people focus on her ministry legacy. Others focus on the rumors, the money, and the unanswered details surrounding her death. But perhaps the most honest way to understand her life is to admit that it was not simple. It was not perfect. It was not the clean, polished version people may have seen on television. Behind the lights, behind the makeup, behind the confident voice and the carefully produced broadcasts, Joni Lamb was living through grief, pressure, criticism, love, conflict, and illness. She spent much of her life telling others to believe in faith, healing, and hope. Yet in the end, her own story became a reminder that even people who speak about strength can be quietly breaking. Even people who lead ministries can face family wounds. Even people who appear powerful can become fragile. And even the most public lives can end with questions that may never fully be answered. Joni Lamb's death closed one chapter of Christian television history, but it also opened a deeper conversation about fame, faith, money, family, and the painful difference between the life people see on screen and the life someone carries when the cameras are turned off. As the public tried to make sense of Joni Lamb's final chapter, one of the most difficult parts of her story was the way her life seemed to split into two separate images. On one side, there was the Joni Lamb millions of viewers had known for years, the composed Christian podcaster, the woman sitting at the table with guests, speaking about healing, faith, marriage, forgiveness, and spiritual strength. On the other side, there was the Joni Lamb who became the subject of painful family allegations, online speculation, financial questions, and personal rumors that only grew louder after her death. That contrast made her story feel even more tragic, because it forced people to ask whether they had ever truly known the woman behind the television image. For many viewers, Joni represented consistency. She was there through decades of Christian programming, through interviews, worship broadcasts, ministry appeals, and emotional testimonies. She had the kind of television presence that felt familiar and safe. Her voice was calm. Her appearance was polished. Her message was usually centered on faith and endurance. But the truth about public life is that consistency on screen does not always mean peace behind the scenes. Sometimes the people who appear the strongest are the ones carrying the heaviest emotional burdens. And in Joni's case, the burdens appeared to multiply in her later years. After Marcus Lamb died, Joni had to stand in a place that few people could understand. She was not simply a grieving widow. She was the widow of a man whose name was tied to an entire religious media empire. Daystar was not a small family project anymore. It was a major Christian television network, with employees, partners, donors, viewers, critics, and a public reputation to protect. Every decision mattered. Every appearance mattered. Every statement could be interpreted, criticized, or defended. For a woman mourning the loss of her husband, that kind of pressure must have been enormous. And yet, the public often expects religious leaders to grieve differently from everyone else. They are expected to be sad, but not broken. Human, but not messy. Faithful, but never uncertain. Strong, but never angry. Joni appeared to carry herself with grace, but that did not mean her private world was easy. Losing Marcus changed everything. It changed the emotional center of her life. It changed the leadership structure around her. It changed how viewers saw her. It changed how her family operated. And in many ways, it placed her under a brighter, harsher spotlight than ever before. Then her remarriage to Dr. Doug Weiss became one of the most talked about decisions of her later life. For some, it was a deeply personal choice that should have been respected. They believed Joni had the right to find companionship again after losing her husband. They saw her as a woman trying to rebuild a future after devastating grief. But others questioned how quickly the relationship became public and how it affected the family dynamic around Daystar. In communities where public image, ministry leadership, and family values are deeply connected, remarriage after widowhood can become more than a personal matter. It can become symbolic. It can become controversial. It can become something people feel entitled to judge. That judgment grew even sharper as family tensions became public. When members of a well-known ministry family begin speaking against each other, the situation becomes almost impossible to contain. Supporters choose sides. Critics search for hidden meaning. Online commentators build theories. Every statement is analyzed, every silence becomes suspicious, and every emotional wound becomes content for strangers. What may have started as private family pain became a public spectacle. And for Joni Lamb, that meant the most intimate parts of her life were no longer fully her own. This is one of the most heartbreaking parts of her story. Joni spent years building a platform that invited people into conversations about healing. But in the end, her own family wounds became part of the conversation. Whether people believed her, criticized her, defended her, or questioned her, the reality remained the same. The final years of her life were not quiet. They were not simple. They were filled with pressure from multiple directions, grief from the past, controversy in the present, uncertainty about the future, and health problems that were reportedly becoming more serious. Health is often the part of a public figure's life that remains hidden until it cannot be hidden anymore. Viewers may notice a change in someone's face, voice, energy, or schedule, but they rarely know the full story. With Joni, the confirmed information surrounding her final illness was limited. Reports said she had serious health issues and that a back injury worsened her condition. But because the explanation was not detailed, people immediately began filling the gaps. Some wanted medical answers. Some wanted scandal. Some wanted to connect her death to the stress surrounding Daystar. Some simply could not accept that someone who had appeared so strong on television could decline so quickly. But human bodies do not follow the expectations of viewers. A person can look strong one month and be struggling the next. A health crisis can accelerate faster than anyone expects. A private condition can remain unknown until the final days. And when someone has lived for decades under public pressure, the emotional weight of that life can be invisible until it is too late to understand it fully. That is why Joni Lamb's death felt so unsettling to many people. It was not only the fact that she died. It was the feeling that the public had only received fragments of the truth. Her net worth became another subject of fascination, especially because religious broadcasting has always carried a complicated relationship with money. Viewers donate because they believe in a mission. Ministries grow because people trust the message. But when a ministry becomes large, wealthy, and powerful, questions naturally follow. How much money is being raised? How is it being used? Who benefits? What lifestyle do the leaders live? These questions are not unique to Daystar, and they are not unique to Joni Lamb, but her story brought them back into focus. Online estimates of Joni Lamb's net worth vary widely, and many of those numbers are difficult to verify. But the public fascination with her wealth was not only about a dollar amount, it was about what that wealth represented. To supporters, prosperity could be seen as a sign of blessing, growth, and successful ministry. To critics, it raised concerns about whether religious media leaders were living too comfortably while asking ordinary believers for donations. This tension has existed in televangelism for decades, and Joni's life became part of that larger debate. Still, it would be unfair to pretend that money alone defines her legacy. Joni Lamb helped shape a media platform that reached millions. She gave airtime to countless pastors, authors, musicians, political voices, and Christian personalities. She helped normalize the idea of women leading serious conversations in Christian television. Her show created a space where emotional topics could be discussed openly, at least within the framework of faith-based media. For many viewers, she was not a controversy. She was comfort. She was familiar. She was part of their daily routine, their prayer life, their home. That is why reactions to her death were so divided. Some mourned her with deep affection, remembering her as a woman who encouraged them during difficult seasons. They remembered the interviews, the prayers, the messages of hope. Others could not separate her from the controversies that surrounded Daystar, especially in her final years. They believed the public deserved transparency. They believed the family conflict mattered. They believed the financial questions mattered. And between those two groups were many people who felt both things at once. Sadness over her death, but discomfort with the unanswered questions. This is often the case with complicated public figures. People want them to be either heroes or villains, but real life rarely works that way. Joni Lamb's life contained devotion, ambition, influence, pain, controversy, and vulnerability. She was capable of inspiring people and also becoming the subject of serious criticism. She built something meaningful for millions, but she also lived inside a world where power, money, family, and faith were tightly connected. That combination can create beauty, but it can also create pressure. And sometimes the pressure becomes too heavy to carry quietly. In the final analysis, what happened to Joni Lamb was not just a medical event. It was the ending of a long, complicated public life. Her death forced people to look back at everything. Her rise with Marcus, the growth of Daystar, the grief of losing her husband, the remarriage that divided opinion, the family tensions that became public, the rumors that followed her, the questions about wealth. and the health struggles that brought her story to an abrupt end. Each piece alone might have been enough to define a chapter. Together, they created a final chapter that felt almost overwhelming, and perhaps that is why her story continues to draw attention. People are not only asking how she died, they are asking what her life really meant. They are asking whether the woman they saw on television was the full truth or only one carefully lit version of it. They are asking how someone who preached healing could end her life surrounded by so much unresolved pain. They are asking how a family built around faith could become so publicly divided. They are asking how a ministry built to bring hope could also become a source of suspicion and controversy. But maybe the most painful truth is that Joni Lamb's story does not offer a clean ending. There is no simple answer that explains everything. There is no single rumor that unlocks the whole mystery. There is no number attached to her net worth that can measure her influence. There is no public statement that can fully describe the private weight she carried. What remains is a life that was both admired and questioned, both powerful and fragile, both public and deeply personal. Joni Lamb once lived in front of cameras that made everything look controlled, intentional, and polished. But her final years revealed something much more human. They showed that even people who build platforms of faith can experience broken relationships. Even people who speak about hope can face fear. Even people who lead millions can feel alone. And even people who seem to have everything, influence, wealth, recognition, and a global audience, can still reach the end of life surrounded by questions that no broadcast can answer. That is the haunting part of Joni Lamb's legacy. She helped create a network that told stories of miracles, redemption, and victory. But her own story ended with grief, speculation, and unfinished conversations. And maybe that is why people cannot stop talking about her. Because behind the rumors, behind the money, behind the arguments, and behind the headlines, there is a woman whose life reminds us that fame inside the world of faith can be just as heavy as fame anywhere else, sometimes heavier. Because when your public image is built around strength, people rarely know what to do when your private life begins to fall apart. What made Joni Lamb's story even more unsettling was not only the fact that she died after a period of serious health struggles, but the way her final years forced people to re-examine everything they thought they knew about her. For so long, she had been presented as a woman of spiritual confidence, a leader who understood pain but always knew how to speak about victory. She had listened to guests share stories of broken marriages, lost loved ones, addiction, betrayal, healing, and redemption. She had nodded with compassion, offered words of faith, and reminded viewers that God could restore what seemed impossible. Yet near the end of her own life, Joni's world appeared to be filled with exactly the kind of wounds she had spent years discussing on television. Grief, family fracture, public judgment, financial suspicion, loneliness, and physical decline. That contradiction is what kept people watching. It was not just curiosity. It was the uncomfortable realization that even the people who speak the language of hope every day are not protected from the hardest parts of being human. Joni Lamb had built her public identity around strength, but strength can become a prison when everyone expects it from you. When a woman like Joni appears on screen for decades, people begin to believe she is always composed, always certain, always spiritually prepared for every storm. But private suffering rarely looks like a sermon. It is not scripted, it is not edited. It does not come with soft lighting or background music. It arrives in hospital rooms, family arguments, legal concerns, sleepless nights, and moments when the person who comforts others has no one left who truly understands the weight she is carrying. After Marcus Lamb's death, that weight became heavier. The public saw Joni continue forward, but continuing forward is not the same as healing. She had lost the man who had been tied to her personal life, her ministry life, and her public identity for 2 decades. Marcus was not simply her husband. He was part of the architecture of her world. Together they had created Daystar, shaped its image, and stood before audiences as a couple united in purpose. When he died, Joni was left with more than memories. She inherited expectations. She inherited responsibility. She inherited a legacy that millions of people had invested in emotionally and financially. and she inherited the scrutiny that comes with leading something so large after the loss of its founder. That scrutiny intensified when questions around Daystar's leadership and family structure became public. In ministries built around family identity, private conflict can feel like a collapse of the brand itself. The Lamb family had not just appeared on television. They had represented a model of Christian unity to many viewers. So when reports of tension surfaced, the emotional reaction was strong. People who loved the network felt confused. Critics felt vindicated. Former supporters began asking whether the image they had trusted had been incomplete all along. And Joni, standing at the center of it, became both a grieving widow and a controversial leader. This is where the story became particularly painful. Public families often suffer in ways ordinary families never experience. Most families argue behind closed doors. Most families grieve privately. Most families make mistakes without millions of people analyzing every detail. But when a family is tied to a major television ministry, there are no truly private conflicts once the walls begin to crack. Every disagreement becomes evidence. Every statement becomes a weapon. Every silence becomes suspicious. And when faith is involved, the stakes become even higher, because people do not only judge behavior, they judge sincerity, morality, and spiritual authority. For Joni Lamb, the marriage to Dr. Doug Weiss added another layer to that tension. It was not simply the story of a widow remarrying. It became a symbol that different people interpreted in completely different ways. Some saw love after loss. Others saw a turning point that changed the balance within the family and ministry. Some defended her right to rebuild her life. Others believed the remarriage exposed deeper fractures behind the scenes. Whether fair or unfair, that relationship became part of the public narrative, and once a narrative begins online, it rarely stays gentle. The internet does not handle grief with tenderness. It turns grief into timelines, theories, accusations, and comment sections. As Joni's health declined, the rumors grew darker. People began trying to connect every detail into one dramatic explanation. Some claimed there had been hidden illnesses. Some speculated about stress. Some questioned whether the emotional conflict around her had contributed to her decline. Others focused on the lack of detailed public information and treated that silence as proof that something was being concealed. But silence does not always mean scandal. Sometimes it means a family is overwhelmed. Sometimes it means medical information is private. Sometimes it means the truth is complicated, painful, and not easily packaged for public consumption. Still, the absence of a complete explanation left space for suspicion. That is the danger of fame. When a public figure dies, especially one connected to controversy, people rarely accept a simple answer. They want a secret. They want a hidden cause. They want someone to blame. They want the final chapter to explain every unresolved question from the earlier chapters. But death often does not work that way. It can arrive suddenly after a decline. It can follow years of private health problems. It can be connected to a specific injury without revealing every condition underneath. And sometimes, even when the medical facts are true, they still do not satisfy the public hunger for meaning. Joni Lamb's net worth became part of that hunger. After her death, people searched not only for her cause of death, but for her money, her assets, her lifestyle, and the financial structure around Daystar. This was not surprising. Televangelism and Christian broadcasting have long existed under public scrutiny because they combine faith with fundraising, ministry with media, and spiritual language with financial power. When religious leaders live comfortably, questions follow. When they ask viewers for donations, questions follow. When a ministry grows into a global platform, questions follow. And when that ministry's leader dies amid family tension, those questions become even louder. But Joni's financial story is difficult to separate from the larger system she helped build. Daystar was not just a television channel. It was a global religious media organization with production facilities, satellite distribution, donor support, programming partnerships, and a deeply loyal audience. Joni's personal lifestyle was therefore viewed through the lens of Daystar's success. To her defenders, any wealth connected to her life was the result of decades of work, leadership, and ministry growth. To her critics, It represented the uncomfortable reality of religious media empires, where spiritual messages and financial prosperity can become impossible to separate. That tension is one of the reasons her legacy remains complicated. If Joni had only been a television host, her passing might have been remembered simply as the loss of a beloved broadcaster. If she had only been a ministry executive, the discussion might have focused on leadership and influence. If she had only been a widow who remarried, the story might have been personal. If she had only been involved in family conflict, the story might have been tabloid drama. But Joni was all of those things at once. That is why people could not easily place her into one category. She was admired and criticized, trusted and questioned, mourned and scrutinized. And perhaps that is what makes her story so human. People prefer public figures to be simple. They want saints or villains, victims or manipulators, heroes or hypocrites. But real lives do not obey those categories. Joni Lamb could be a woman who comforted millions and still leave behind unanswered questions. She could be a leader who built something meaningful and still be part of painful controversy. She could be a person of faith and still experience family fracture. She could be wealthy and still be wounded. She could smile on television and still suffer in private. None of those truths cancel the others. They only make the story harder to tell honestly. In her final chapter, the contrast between image and reality became impossible to ignore. The television image was controlled, polished, and purposeful. The reality appeared messy, fragile, and unresolved. And for viewers who had spent years watching her, that contrast felt almost personal. They had invited her into their homes. They had trusted her voice. They had watched her pray, laugh, interview guests, and talk about life's deepest pain. So when her own life became painful, they felt like they were watching the curtain pull back on a world they thought they understood. That is why Joni Lamb's death became more than an obituary. It became a mirror. It reflected the complicated relationship people have with religious celebrities. Viewers want leaders who are relatable, but also stronger than ordinary people. They want honesty, but not too much mess. They want transparency, but only when it confirms what they already believe. They want spiritual authority, but are shocked when that authority exists inside a flawed human life. Joni's story exposed all of that tension. It reminded people that the women and men on religious television are still human beings navigating ambition, fear, love, ego, grief, loyalty, and betrayal. The tragedy is that by the time many people began asking deeper questions about Joni Lamb, she was no longer here to answer them. The story had moved beyond her control. Her image belonged to the public. Her controversies belonged to commentators. Her legacy belonged to supporters and critics, and her final medical details remained partly private. That is a painful ending for anyone, but especially for someone who had spent so much of her life communicating directly with an audience. For decades, Joni had spoken into cameras. In the end, others were speaking about her. And maybe that is the most haunting part of all. Joni Lamb's life was built around storytelling, testimonies, interviews, broadcasts, messages of hope. Yet her own final story became fragmented, told through reports, rumors, statements, accusations, memories, and speculation. Some pieces are clear. She helped build Daystar. She lost Marcus. She remarried. She faced family tensions. She struggled with serious health problems. She died at 65. But other pieces remain uncertain, and those uncertainties are where the rumors live. Still, if there is one thing her life makes clear, it is that public success does not protect anyone from private sorrow. Joni Lamb reached millions, but she could not escape grief. She helped lead a global network, but she could not avoid family pain. She spoke often about healing, but her final years seemed marked by wounds that were still open. She lived in a world of bright lights and spiritual language, but her ending was shadowed by the same questions that follow so many human lives. Was she understood? Was she at peace? Did the people closest to her truly know what she was carrying? And did the public ever see the real Joni Lamb, or only the version that television allowed them to see? That is why her story still feels unfinished. Not because every rumor deserves belief, and not because every accusation tells the whole truth, but because her life contained too many layers to be reduced to one explanation. Joni Lamb's final years were not simply about death. They were about legacy. They were about image. They were about the cost of building a ministry empire. They were about what happens when a family becomes a brand, when grief becomes public, and when faith becomes inseparable from money and power. And in the end, Joni Lamb left behind a question larger than the rumors surrounding her death. What happens when the person who spent her life offering answers becomes the mystery everyone else is trying to solve? As Joni Lamb's story continued to unfold in the public imagination, one of the most painful questions was not simply what happened to her body, but what happened to the world she had built around herself. Daystar was more than a network. It was a stage, a ministry, a business, a family legacy, and for many viewers, a spiritual home. For years, Joni had sat at the center of that world, helping shape its tone and image. She understood television. She understood emotion. She understood how to create a moment that felt intimate, even though it was being broadcast to millions. But in the end, the same platform that made her powerful also made her vulnerable. When her life became complicated, there was nowhere to hide. The tragedy of Joni Lamb's final years was that everything seemed to happen in public layers. First came the loss of Marcus, a grief that would have shaken anyone. Then came the responsibility of carrying forward the ministry they had built together. Then came the remarriage that some accepted and others questioned. Then came the family conflict that turned private pain into public discussion. Then came the health decline, the unanswered medical questions, and finally, the death announcement that left supporters stunned and critics searching for context. Each chapter on its own was difficult. Together, they created the sense of a woman surrounded by pressure from every direction. For someone like Joni, image was not a small thing. Religious television depends heavily on trust. Viewers do not simply watch for entertainment. They watch because they believe the person on screen represents something deeper. They believe the host is sincere. They believe the message is meaningful. They believe the ministry is guided by faith, not just strategy. That is why any crack in the image can feel so devastating. When a public religious figure is accused of being distant from family, or tied to financial controversy, or surrounded by unanswered questions, the reaction becomes more emotional than ordinary celebrity gossip. People feel as if something sacred has been disturbed. And this is where Joni's story became especially difficult. She had spent years communicating certainty. On television, faith often has to be presented with confidence. There is little room for hesitation. The host must smile, listen, encourage, pray, transition smoothly to the next segment, and keep the message moving. But real life does not move that way. Real life interrupts. Real life brings grief before a person is ready. Real life brings family conflict that cannot be solved in a 30-minute broadcast. Real life brings illness that no camera angle can soften. And real life sometimes exposes the gap between what people preach and what they are privately trying to survive. That gap became one of the central themes of Joni Lamb's later life. She was known for conversations about healing, but her own family wounds appeared unresolved. She spoke often about hope, but her final years were clouded by tension. She represented faith-based leadership, but that leadership came under scrutiny. She belonged to a world that often talked about victory, yet her ending felt marked by loss. This does not mean her faith was false. It means her life was human. And sometimes the most human stories are the ones religious audiences struggle to accept, because they do not fit neatly into a testimony with a clean ending. The rumors surrounding her death only deepened that struggle. When people do not receive every detail, they create their own. Some imagined a hidden illness. Some believed stress had destroyed her health. Some searched for signs in old videos, comparing her appearance, her voice, her posture, her energy. Others treated every family dispute as if it were a clue in a mystery. But this is the danger of turning a real death into a public puzzle. It can erase the person at the center of it. Joni Lamb became, for some people, less of a woman who had died and more of a case to be solved. Yet even with all the speculation, the confirmed picture remained more restrained. She had serious health struggles. A back injury reportedly worsened her condition. Her decline came quickly enough to shock many people. Beyond that, the public did not have every medical detail. That absence may feel frustrating to viewers, but it is also a reminder that not every part of a public figure's body belongs to the public. Even someone who spent decades on television still had a private medical reality. Even someone who became a symbol still had the right to pain that was not turned into entertainment. Still, the unanswered questions mattered because they connected to a larger pattern in her life. People were not only asking about her death because of medical curiosity. They were asking because so much else around her had become uncertain. The family tensions raised questions about trust. The financial debates raised questions about accountability. The remarriage raised questions about loyalty, grief, and leadership. Her death, coming after all of that, felt to many like the final piece of a story that still did not make sense. And when a story does not make sense, audiences keep searching. Her net worth, too, became part of the search for meaning. Money has always been one of the most sensitive subjects in religious broadcasting. When a pastor or Christian television leader becomes wealthy, the public reaction is rarely neutral. Some see it as evidence of success and blessing. Others see it as contradiction. Joni lived inside that tension for decades. Daystar's reach suggested influence, resources, and power. But influence and power also invite criticism. People wanted to know whether the lifestyle matched the message, whether the finances matched the mission, and whether the public image of ministry could withstand serious questions about wealth. For Joni's supporters, these questions could feel cruel, especially after her death. They remembered her as a woman who ministered to them through television, who carried conversations that brought comfort, who endured the loss of her husband and continued forward. They saw the criticism as opportunistic, a way for people to attack a woman who could no longer defend herself. But for critics, death did not erase the need for accountability. They believed that when a ministry reaches millions and receives donor support, the public has a right to ask hard questions. This divide did not disappear when Joni died. In some ways, it became sharper. That divide is part of why her legacy remains unresolved. Some legacies become clear with time. Others become more complicated. Joni Lamb's legacy belongs to both admiration and controversy. She was a pioneer for women in Christian television. Yet she was also tied to a ministry world that many people believe needs greater transparency. She comforted viewers, yet her own family story became painful and public. She projected strength, yet her final health crisis revealed vulnerability. She lived with influence, yet influence could not shield her from loneliness, criticism, or death. The emotional power of her story comes from that contradiction. It is easy to make a simple video about a public figure's rise and fall. It is harder to tell the story of someone whose life contained both genuine impact and serious questions. Joni Lamb was not simply the victim of rumors. She was not simply the face of controversy. She was a person who lived inside a world where faith, television, family, and money were intertwined so tightly that separating them became almost impossible. When one part of that world cracked, everything else felt unstable. And that may be the deeper tragedy. Joni Lamb helped build a ministry that promised people clarity, hope, and spiritual direction. But her final chapter left behind confusion, grief, and competing versions of the truth. To some, she died as a beloved Christian leader who had given her life to ministry. To others, she died as a symbol of the unresolved problems inside religious media empires. To her family, she was something far more personal than any public debate could capture. She was a mother, a grandmother, a wife, a widow, a leader, and a woman whose choices affected people who loved her deeply. The public will never fully know what it felt like to be Joni Lamb in those final years. They will never know every private conversation, every sleepless night, every moment of fear, every argument, every prayer, every doctor's warning, every emotional cost of continuing to appear strong. They will only know fragments. They will know the broadcasts. They will know the announcements. They will know the rumors. They will know the statements made by others. But the inner life of Joni Lamb, the place where grief and fear all met, may remain forever hidden. That hidden inner life is what makes her story so haunting. People assume that fame reveals a person, but often it conceals them. The more public someone becomes, the more carefully managed their image must be. Every word is measured. Every appearance is styled. Every weakness is either hidden or turned into a message. For Joni, television created intimacy, but it also created distance. Viewers felt close to her, yet they did not truly know what was happening when the cameras stopped rolling. They knew the host, they knew the voice, they knew the smile. But did they know the woman? That question sits at the center of her legacy. Who was Joni Lamb beyond Daystar, beyond Marcus, beyond Doug Weiss, beyond the family conflict, beyond the wealth estimates, beyond the rumors about her death? Was she a woman who believed deeply in the mission she built? Was she a leader trying to protect what she had spent decades creating? Was she a grieving widow who moved forward in a way others could not understand? Was she a mother trapped in a conflict too painful to solve publicly? Was she all of these things at once? The answer is probably yes. And that is why her story cannot be told honestly as a simple tragedy or a simple scandal. It must be told as a complicated human life lived under extraordinary public pressure. Joni Lamb's death did not erase her achievements, but it also did not erase the questions. It did not silence her supporters, but it did not quiet her critics. It did not end the conversation about Daystar, family, money, and ministry. Instead, it made the conversation more emotional because now every question is tied to loss. In the end, Joni Lamb's final chapter reminds us that public faith can become a heavy burden when it leaves no room for visible weakness. It reminds us that families presented as perfect may be carrying wounds no audience can see. It reminds us that money and ministry, once intertwined, can create suspicion even among believers. It reminds us that grief does not follow a schedule, remarriage does not heal every wound, and success does not protect anyone from decline. Most of all, it reminds us that the person on the screen is never the whole person. Joni Lamb lived much of her life in front of cameras, but the deepest parts of her story happened away from them. Her death left a silence that people immediately tried to fill with theories, judgments, and memories. But maybe the silence itself says something. Maybe it tells us that no matter how much the public wants answers, some lives end with mystery. Some stories remain unfinished. Some wounds are carried into the grave. And some people, no matter how long they were watched by millions, remain partly unknown. That is the sorrow at the heart of Joni Lamb's story. She spent decades helping others tell their testimonies. But her own final testimony was fractured by rumor, grief, conflict, and unanswered questions. She built a platform meant to broadcast hope, yet her ending forced people to confront pain. She became a symbol of faith, yet her life revealed how fragile even symbols can be. And when the cameras finally stopped, what remained was not a perfect legacy, but a deeply human one, powerful, controversial, unfinished, and impossible to ignore. By the time people began looking back on Joni Lamb's life after her passing, the conversation had moved far beyond one woman's health crisis. It had become a larger story about faith, power, image, family, and the cost of being watched for decades. Joni had lived so much of her adult life in front of cameras that many viewers felt they knew her personally. They knew the way she spoke, the way she listened, the way she leaned into emotional conversations, the way she used faith to frame pain. But knowing someone through a screen is not the same as knowing the weight they carry when the lights go down. And in Joni's case, the difference between the public woman and the private woman may be the most important part of the story. Her final years seemed to expose that difference more clearly than ever. Publicly, she was still attached to the language of ministry, strength, and purpose. Privately, she appeared to be moving through grief, remarriage, family division, leadership pressure, health problems, and the emotional burden of constant scrutiny. That is not a small amount for anyone to endure. It is especially heavy for someone whose life had been built around the expectation of spiritual confidence. People wanted Joni to be strong because they had always seen her that way. But strength, when demanded for too long, can become exhausting. It can become a performance. It can become a role a person is trapped inside, even when she is hurting. This is one reason her death felt so disturbing to many viewers. It seemed to arrive after a season when the pressure around her had already become intense. Daystar was facing public questions. Her family relationships were being discussed. Her remarriage had drawn attention. Her health was declining, and then suddenly she was gone. For supporters, it felt like losing a spiritual figure who had been part of their homes for years. For critics, it felt like the end of a chapter that still required answers. For casual observers, it was a shocking reminder that even powerful religious media figures are fragile, human, and mortal. But Joni Lamb's story also raises a deeper question about what happens when ministry becomes inseparable from personality. Daystar was a network, but it was also deeply tied to the Lamb family image. Viewers were not only watching programs, they were watching a brand built around people, relationships, testimony, and trust. Marcus and Joni were not anonymous executives behind a media company. They were the faces of the mission. Their marriage, their family, their faith, and their public presence all became part of Daystar's identity. That kind of influence can be powerful, but it can also be dangerous, because when the people at the center begin to suffer, the entire structure feels shaken. After Marcus died, the pressure on Joni must have been extraordinary. She was expected to mourn, lead, reassure, and continue. She was expected to honor the past while guiding the future. She was expected to remain faithful to the ministry's legacy while making personal choices that not everyone understood. And when she remarried, that personal choice became public property. People examined it not simply as a relationship, but as a statement about grief, loyalty, family, and leadership. In an ordinary life, remarriage after widowhood may be complicated enough. In Joni's life, it became part of a national conversation among viewers, critics, and online commentators. The family conflict that followed made the situation even more painful. Nothing damages a public ministry image more deeply than visible conflict within the family that helped build it. It is one thing for critics outside the ministry to raise questions. 'Tis another thing when the pain appears to come from inside the house. When relatives disagree publicly, the audience begins to wonder what was hidden for years. Were there tensions that viewers never saw? Were leadership decisions more complicated than they appeared? Was the polished family image on television only part of the truth? These questions may be uncomfortable, but they are exactly the kind of questions that arise when a ministry is built around personal trust. For Joni, this meant that the most private relationships in her life became part of her public legacy. That is a cruel thing. Family pain is difficult enough when it happens quietly. It becomes far more damaging when strangers feel invited to judge every person involved. Some viewers blamed Joni. Others defended her. Some blamed those who spoke out against her. Others believed their voices needed to be heard. But beneath all of that public argument was a family experiencing real pain. And once pain becomes entertainment, it often loses its humanity. That is one of the dangers of stories like this. The public wants drama. The public wants betrayal, secrets, hidden causes, shocking numbers, and emotional revelations. A title like What Really Happened promises answers. It promises that the mystery will be solved. But sometimes the truth is not one shocking secret. Sometimes the truth is a slow accumulation of grief, pressure, illness, conflict, misunderstanding, and choices that look different depending on who is telling the story. Joni Lamb's final chapter seems to belong to that second category. It was not one simple event. It was a convergence of many difficult realities. Her health decline became the final and most visible sign that something was wrong. Reports said she had serious health issues, and that a back injury worsened her condition. But because the exact medical details were not fully laid out for the public, speculation rushed in. That speculation says as much about the audience as it does about Joni. People are uncomfortable with uncertainty. They want a cause they can name. They want a timeline they can understand. They want death to make sense. But illness often does not give the public that kind of neat explanation. The body can fail quietly. A private condition can become serious quickly. An injury can complicate existing problems, and the final days of a person's life may remain known only to those closest to them. Still, the rumors continued because Joni's life had already become a place where people projected their beliefs. Those who trusted her saw attacks against her as unfair and cruel. Those who distrusted the world of televangelism saw her story as part of a larger pattern of secrecy and excess. Those fascinated by celebrity tragedy focused on the emotional drama. Those interested in religious accountability focused on Daystar's finances, leadership, and controversies. Each group looked at the same life and saw something different. That is why her legacy is so divided. The question of net worth is a perfect example. On the surface, it is a simple search. How much money did Joni Lamb have? But beneath that question is something far more emotional. People are really asking whether a woman who preached faith and helped lead a donor-supported ministry lived in a way that matched the message. They are asking whether religious broadcasting rewards its leaders too much. They are asking whether viewers who give from modest incomes truly understand where the money goes. And they are asking whether wealth changes the spiritual authority of a public ministry figure. These questions existed before Joni Lamb, and they will continue after her, but her death brought them back into focus. At the same time, focusing only on money can distort the story. Joni's influence was not imaginary. She helped create television that mattered deeply to many people. She gave a platform to testimonies, Christian authors, pastors, musicians, and voices that might not have reached such a broad audience otherwise. Her work was part of the daily rhythm of many homes. For some viewers, Daystar was not just programming, it was companionship. It was background prayer during lonely mornings. It was comfort during illness. It was a connection to a larger community of faith. Joni was part of that emotional world, and that should not be dismissed. But neither should the controversy be ignored. A mature view of Joni Lamb's life has to hold both realities at once. She was influential and she was questioned. She inspired people and she became the center of painful allegations. She represented faith, and she lived within systems of wealth and power that deserved scrutiny. She was loved by many and criticized by many. Her life cannot be reduced to praise, but it also cannot be reduced to scandal. The truth is heavier than either version. That heaviness is what makes her story fit so powerfully into the larger history of televangelism. Religious broadcasting has always walked a difficult line between ministry and performance. The camera changes everything. It turns prayer into programming. It turns testimony into content. It turns leaders into personalities. It turns family into brand identity. And when a person becomes both a spiritual figure and a media figure, their life is no longer interpreted only as personal. Every decision becomes symbolic. Every mistake becomes evidence. Every illness becomes speculation. Every death becomes a public event. Joni Lamb lived at the center of that world. She understood its power, and she benefited from it. But she also paid the price of it. The same visibility that gave her influence made her final years impossible to endure privately. The same audience that loved her also demanded answers. The same network that made her a household name in Christian media also made her family's pain part of a larger public narrative. And when her body began to fail, the public did not simply mourn. It investigated. That may be the most tragic part of all. Joni Lamb's life ended not in silence, but in noise. Rumors, headlines, debates, comments, searches, accusations, defenses, tributes, and questions. Everyone seemed to want the final word on who she was. But perhaps no public figure can be fully captured by the people watching from the outside. The woman who appeared on television was real, but she was not complete. The controversies were real, but they were not the whole person. The grief was real. The influence was real. The questions were real. And the humanity beneath all of it was real too. In the end, Joni Lamb's story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the people who build lives around certainty leave behind the most uncertainty. She spent years helping others frame their pain through faith, but her own pain was not easily framed. She spoke often about healing, but the wounds around her family and legacy remained open. She lived in a world that celebrated victory, but her final chapter felt marked by loss. She helped create a network that broadcast hope to millions, yet her death left many people feeling confused, unsettled, and searching for answers. Maybe that is why the story continues to resonate. It is not only about Joni Lamb. It is about the fragile line between public image and private truth. It is about the cost of being strong when everyone expects strength. It is about the danger of confusing a television persona with a complete human being. It is about how money complicates ministry, how grief complicates leadership, and how family conflict can shatter even the most carefully built image. It is about a woman who became powerful in a world of faith, but who still faced the same human realities as everyone else: love, loss, illness, conflict, and death. And when all the rumors are stripped away, when the speculation quits, when the net worth searches fade, what remains is a complicated legacy that refuses to fit neatly into one sentence. Joni Lamb was a broadcaster, a builder, a believer, a widow, a wife, a mother, a leader, a controversial figure, and a woman whose final years revealed the cost of living under constant public expectation. She left behind a network, a family, a following, a debate, and a mystery that may never be fully resolved. That is why her story feels so haunting. Not because every rumor is true, not because every criticism is fair, not because every tribute tells the full story, but because Joni Lamb's life reminds us that behind every public figure is a private person no audience can completely know. And sometimes, when that person is gone, the world is left not with answers, but with fragments, pieces of faith, grief, power, love, controversy, and silence, scattered across a life that was watched by millions, but understood by very few. In the final chapter of Joni Lamb's story, the most haunting part is not simply that she died, but that she left behind so many different versions of herself in the minds of the people who watched her. To some, she was a faithful woman who helped build one of the most influential Christian television networks in the world. To others, she was a symbol of the unanswered questions that surround wealth, power, and celebrity inside religious media. To her supporters, she was a voice of comfort, a woman who kept going after losing her husband, a broadcaster who spent decades speaking about faith and hope. To her critics, she became part of a larger conversation about transparency, family conflict, and the hidden costs of ministry empires. But somewhere beneath all of those opinions was a real woman whose life was far more complicated than any tribute, accusation, rumor, or headline could fully explain. That is what makes her ending feel so heavy. Joni Lamb did not leave behind a simple legacy. She left behind a divided one. Her life cannot be remembered only through the bright lights of Daystar, but it also cannot be judged only through the controversies that surrounded her final years. Both realities existed at the same time. She helped create something that reached millions of people, but she also lived inside a system that raised difficult questions. She comforted viewers, but her own family life became painful and public. She spoke about healing, but many wounds around her seemed unresolved. She preached strength, but her final days revealed how fragile even the strongest public figures can become. For years, Joni's image was tied to control. Television creates that illusion. The lighting is controlled. The camera angles are controlled. The conversation is edited, shaped, and timed. Even emotion becomes part of the production. A tear, a prayer, a testimony, a moment of silence. All of it happens within a broadcast structure. Viewers see vulnerability, but it is still vulnerability inside a frame. Real life is different. Real life is not framed so cleanly. It is chaotic, unpredictable, and often unfair. And in Joni's final years, the controlled world of television seemed to collide with the uncontrollable reality of grief, family division, public criticism, and illness. After Marcus Lamb's death, Joni had to redefine herself in front of an audience that already believed it knew who she was. That is not easy. When someone spends decades as part of a public couple, the loss of one person changes the meaning of the other. Marcus and Joni had been presented as partners in life and ministry. Their marriage was part of Daystar's identity. Their story was part of the network's emotional foundation. When Marcus died, Joni was left to carry not only her own grief, but also the grief of an audience, the expectations of a ministry, and the responsibility of a legacy. Many people saw her continue forward and assumed that meant she was strong. But sometimes continuing forward is not proof that someone is healed. Sometimes it only means there is no other choice. Her remarriage to Dr. Doug Weiss became one of the most controversial turns in that new chapter. It forced viewers to confront something uncomfortable. Public grief does not belong entirely to the person experiencing it. When a famous widow remarries, especially in a religious community, people feel entitled to interpret the timing, the meaning, and the emotional truth behind it. Some believed Joni had found a second chance at love. Others felt unsettled by how it changed the family dynamic and the public image of Daystar. But whatever people believed, one thing was clear. Joni's personal life had become inseparable from her public role. She could not make a private decision without it becoming part of the ministry's story. That is a difficult way to live. Most people are allowed to grieve imperfectly. They are allowed to make choices others do not understand. They are allowed to change, withdraw, begin again, or make mistakes without millions of people turning those choices into commentary. Joni did not have that freedom. Every step she took after Marcus's death was watched. Every relationship was interpreted. Every family conflict became a sign of something larger. Every health concern became a clue. And by the time she died, the public had already built its own competing narratives around her. The family conflict was perhaps the most painful part of that narrative. Family wounds carry a special kind of sorrow because they are rooted in love, memory, expectation, and disappointment. When those wounds become public, they change shape. They are no longer only about the people involved. They become evidence in a larger argument. Supporters and critics begin choosing sides. Strangers speak with certainty about relationships they have never witnessed firsthand. And the people at the center are left not only with their original pain, but with the added burden of being judged by an audience. For a ministry family, that burden is even heavier. Religious media often presents family as proof of spiritual credibility. A strong family becomes part of the message. A united family becomes part of the brand. But when that unity fractures, the damage is not merely personal. It becomes theological, emotional, and reputational. People begin asking whether the message was real. They begin questioning whether the image was carefully manufactured. They begin wondering how a ministry that spoke so often about restoration could not restore peace within its own house. Whether those questions are fair or unfair, they are almost inevitable when a public ministry is built around personal trust. Joni Lamb's final illness arrived in the middle of that already complicated atmosphere. That is why the questions around her death became so intense. If she had passed away quietly after a long, clearly explained illness, perhaps the public reaction would have been different. But because her health decline came after years of grief, controversy, and family tension, people immediately connected the dots in different ways. Some looked for a medical cause. Some looked for emotional causes. Some looked for scandal. Some looked for someone to blame. But death rarely offers the kind of clean explanation people want. It does not always arrive with a single answer that satisfies everyone. What can be said carefully is that Joni reportedly faced serious health struggles, and her condition worsened after a back injury. Beyond that, many of the more dramatic claims surrounding her death remain speculation. And that distinction matters. A story can be emotional without becoming reckless. A life can be mysterious without every rumor being true. A death can be painful without needing to be turned into conspiracy. The real tragedy does not require exaggeration. A woman who helped build a global Christian television network died after years of personal loss, family tension, public scrutiny, and declining health. That is already heartbreaking enough. Yet the internet often does not know how to leave grief alone. It turns unanswered questions into theories. It turns private pain into public entertainment. It turns a death announcement into a search trend. And Joni Lamb's name became attached to exactly that cycle. People searched for her cause of death, her net worth, her husband, her children, her lifestyle, her controversies, and her final days. Some searched because they cared. Some searched because they were suspicious. Some searched because tragedy attracts attention. But in all of that searching, the humanity of the person can easily disappear. That is why the story needs to be told with care. Joni Lamb was not just a mystery to be solved. She was a woman who lived through extraordinary public pressure. She was part of a generation of religious broadcasters who understood the power of television to shape belief, emotion, and loyalty. She helped create a platform that many people loved and many others questioned. She lived with privilege and influence, but also with grief and vulnerability. She was both powerful and fragile. She was both admired and criticized. She was both a leader and a person whose life ended with unresolved pain. Her net worth and lifestyle will continue to be discussed, because money remains one of the most controversial parts of religious media. People want to know how much she had, how she lived, and whether the wealth surrounding Daystar reflected blessing, business success, or something more troubling. But the truth is that no estimated number can fully explain Joni Lamb. Wealth may explain part of the public fascination, but it cannot explain the emotional weight of her life. It cannot explain the grief of losing Marcus. It cannot explain the complexity of remarriage. It cannot explain the pain of family division. It cannot explain what it felt like to face illness while the world was watching. And perhaps that is the lesson hidden inside her story. Public figures are often turned into symbols, because symbols are easier to understand than people. A symbol can be praised or condemned. A symbol can be defended or attacked. But a person is harder. A person contains contradictions. A person can do meaningful work and still make choices others question. A person can inspire millions and still hurt people close to them. A person can speak about faith and still feel fear. A person can appear confident and still be breaking inside. Joni Lamb's life forces that uncomfortable recognition. By the end, the woman who had spent so many years helping others tell their stories became the subject of a story she could no longer control. Others interpreted her choices. Others debated her legacy. Others speculated about her death. Others tried to define what her life meant. But maybe the truth of Joni Lamb cannot be found in any single interpretation. Maybe it exists in the tension between them. She was a builder of Christian media, and she was a controversial figure. She was a grieving widow, and she was a powerful leader. She was a public voice of faith, and she was a private person facing pain most viewers never saw. She was loved, questioned, defended, criticized, and finally mourned. That is why her story continues to hold attention. It is not just because of rumors. It is because her life represents something larger than herself. It represents the complicated world of televised faith, where ministry and media become one, where family becomes part of the brand, where money and morality are constantly debated, and where leaders are expected to appear spiritually certain even when their private lives are falling apart. Joni Lamb lived at the center of that world, and her ending revealed both its power and its cost. In the final moments of any public life, people often search for one sentence that can summarize everything. But Joni Lamb's life resists that. She was not only a success story. She was not only a tragedy. She was not only a scandal. She was not only a beloved broadcaster. She was all of those things in different ways, depending on who was watching and what they were whistling to see. Her death did not settle the debate. It deepened it. It made people look back at the broadcasts, the family, the money, the marriage, the illness, the rumors, and the unanswered questions with even more intensity. And still, beneath all of that noise, there remains a quieter truth. Joni Lamb was human. Not the untouchable figure some supporters wanted her to be. Not the one-dimensional villain some critics imagined. Human, capable of faith and fear, capable of influence and error, capable of love and conflict, capable of strength and exhaustion. Her life unfolded on a public stage, but her deepest struggles were likely carried in private. And when she was gone, the world was left with fragments, trying to assemble a complete picture from pieces that may never fully fit together. That is the real sadness of Joni Lamb's final chapter. The cameras gave people access to her image, but not necessarily to her truth. The broadcasts made her familiar, but not fully known. The headlines explained parts of her story, but not the whole of it. And the rumors may have made her death more dramatic, but they did not make it more human. The humanity was already there, in the grief, in the pressure, in the family pain, in the health struggle, in the silence after the final broadcast. Joni Lamb spent decades in a world that promised answers, healing, and hope. But her own ending left behind questions, conflict, and mystery. Maybe that is why it feels so haunting, because it reminds us that even the people who speak most confidently about faith still live inside fragile bodies, complicated families, and uncertain futures. It reminds us that a polished image can hide enormous pain. It reminds us that public success can never guarantee private peace. And it reminds us that when the cameras stop rolling, every person, no matter how famous, powerful, or admired, must face the same truth. Behind the image, behind the legacy, behind the rumors, there is always a human life. Unfinished, imperfect, and impossible to fully explain. When people look back at Joni Lamb's life, one of the most difficult things to accept is that her story does not end with a clean answer. It ends with fragments. It ends with memories from viewers who loved her, questions from critics who doubted the world she represented, pain from family members who lived closer to the truth than the public ever could, and rumors from strangers who tried to turn uncertainty into certainty. That is why her final chapter continues to feel unresolved. It is not only about the cause of death, the net worth, the lifestyle, or the controversies. It is about the uncomfortable realization that a woman who spent decades speaking through a screen may have remained deeply unknown even to the people who watched her most faithfully. For years, Joni Lamb was part of the emotional furniture of Christian television. She was there in living rooms, bedrooms, hospital rooms, and quiet kitchens, where viewers turned on Daystar looking for comfort. She became familiar in a way few broadcasters do, because religious television does not function like ordinary entertainment. Viewers do not only watch, they attach trust, prayer, money, hope, and personal pain to the person on screen. That kind of connection can make a host feel like family, even when the relationship is completely one-sided. And because of that, Joni's death felt intimate to people who had never met her. They were not just losing a television personality. They were losing a voice that had accompanied them through their own private seasons of suffering. But intimacy through television is complicated. It gives viewers emotional closeness without true knowledge. They saw Joni's face, heard her voice, watched her ask questions, and listened to her talk about faith. But they did not see every private argument, every anxious night, every medical fear, every financial decision, every family wound, or every moment when she may have felt completely alone. They saw a version of her that was real, but incomplete. And after her death, that incomplete version became the foundation for countless interpretations. Some people filled the gaps with love. Others filled them with suspicion. Others filled them with dramatic theories. But all of them were working from pieces, not the whole truth. That is the burden of becoming a public religious figure. You are not allowed to be only yourself. You become a symbol of the message you deliver. If you speak about faith, people expect you to live above ordinary doubt. If you speak about family, people expect your family to look whole. If you speak about healing, people expect your wounds to be resolved. If you speak about generosity, people examine your money. If you speak about strength, people are shocked when your body fails. Joni Lamb lived under all of those expectations, and by the end of her life, those expectations became part of the weight surrounding her story. The confirmed facts of her final years already carried enough sadness. She lost Marcus Lamb, the man with whom she had built her adult life and public ministry. She continued forward in a leadership role at Daystar. She remarried, and that remarriage became the subject of intense discussion. Family tensions became public, creating a painful contrast with the ministry's message of unity and restoration. Her health declined after serious struggles, reportedly worsened by a back injury. Then she died at 65, leaving supporters shocked and critics searching for context. None of that needed embellishment to feel tragic. But in the age of online speculation, tragedy is rarely allowed to remain simple. People wanted a hidden reason. They wanted a dramatic cause. They wanted the rumors to explain what the official statements did not. But the truth about death is often less cinematic and more devastating. A person can decline because of medical complications that do not make for a dramatic headline. A body can weaken while the world is distracted by controversy. A public figure can suffer privately, while everyone else argues about money, family, and reputation. And sometimes the most painful answer is that there may not be one single answer that satisfies everyone. Still, Joni's death became inseparable from the larger questions around Daystar. That was almost unavoidable. Her life and the network were so closely connected that one could not be discussed without the other. Daystar was not merely a workplace. It was the great project of her life, the platform that made her influential, wealthy, admired, and scrutinized. It was a ministry to some and a media empire to others. It broadcast messages of hope and faith, But it also existed within the complicated world of fundraising, leadership, public image, and financial power. When Joni died, people did not only ask what happened to her. They asked what her life revealed about the institution she helped build. That question is bigger than one person. It reaches into the heart of televangelism itself. For decades, religious broadcasting has blurred the line between ministry and performance. It offers prayer through cameras, intimacy through screens, and spiritual authority through media production. It can comfort the lonely, encourage the sick, and create community across distance. But it can also turn leaders into celebrities, families into brands, and personal suffering into content. Joni Lamb's story shows both sides of that world. She helped create something that many viewers found meaningful, but she also became trapped inside the scrutiny that comes when faith, fame, and money intersect. Her lifestyle and net worth became part of that scrutiny, because people instinctively know that money changes the way religious authority is perceived. When a ministry leader lives well, supporters may call it blessing, but critics may call it excess. When a network grows internationally, some see success, while others ask whether the mission has become too intertwined with power. Joni's exact personal wealth may remain difficult to verify, but the public fascination with it reveals something important. People were not only curious about a number, they were trying to decide whether the image of ministry matched the reality of privilege. They were trying to understand whether a woman who spoke about faith was also living inside the contradictions of a wealthy religious media system. Yet even that conversation can become too cold if it forgets the person. Joni Lamb was not only a financial question. She was not only a ministry executive. She was not only a widow who remarried. She was not only a mother in a divided family. She was not only a woman whose death sparked rumors. She was all of those things at once, and that is precisely why her story remains so difficult. Real lives do not fit neatly into the categories the public prefers. People want to know whether she was good or bad, victim or villain, sincere or false, strong or broken. But a human being can be sincere and flawed, influential and wounded, generous and controversial, loved and criticized. That complexity is what made her final public image so fragile. In earlier years, viewers could see Joni as part of a stable Christian broadcasting family. Marcus and Joni represented partnership. Daystar represented mission. The shows represented hope. But after Marcus's death, that stability began to shift. The remarriage changed the emotional landscape. The family conflict challenged the image of unity. The health crisis introduced fear and uncertainty. The rumors turned private suffering into public debate. And by the time of her death, the old image no longer felt complete. It had cracked. And through those cracks, people saw something less polished but more human. The tragedy is that many people only accept the humanity of public figures after they are gone. While they are alive, they are expected to perform certainty. They are expected to answer criticism gracefully, absorb grief quietly, and continue appearing strong. Only after death does the public begin to soften, to wonder what they carried, to imagine the loneliness behind the smile. But by then, the person can no longer speak. They can no longer clarify. They can no longer say which stories were true, which were exaggerated, which wounds were deepest, or which choices they regretted. Death freezes a public figure in the middle of competing narratives, and everyone else keeps arguing over the meaning. For Joni Lamb, that frozen image is especially powerful because she spent her career helping others shape their testimonies. A testimony has a structure. It begins with pain, moves through struggle, and ends with redemption. It gives suffering purpose. It reassures the listener that darkness can become light. But Joni's own ending did not arrive with that kind of clarity. It did not provide a neatly packaged redemption arc. It left behind unresolved family tension, unanswered medical details, disputed interpretations of her lifestyle, and a divided public response. In that sense, her final story was not like a television testimony. It was more like real life, unfinished, contradictory, and painful. And maybe that is why it is so haunting. It strips away the illusion that faith makes a life simple. Faith may give people language for suffering, but it does not remove suffering. It may offer hope, but it does not guarantee harmony. It may promise healing, But not every relationship is healed before death. It may speak of peace, but not every final chapter feels peaceful to those left watching. Joni Lamb lived inside a world that often emphasized victory, but her story reminds us that even people of faith can leave behind questions. That does not make her legacy meaningless. If anything, it makes it more serious. Her life forces viewers to think harder about the difference between inspiration and idolization. It is one thing to be encouraged by a public figure. It is another thing to assume that the person on screen is above the struggles they discuss. Joni's story asks the audience to recognize the danger of turning religious broadcasters into untouchable symbols. When that happens, their humanity becomes inconvenient. Their pain becomes shocking. Their mistakes become scandals. Their illness becomes a mystery. Their death becomes content. By the end, Joni Lamb's legacy stood at the intersection of gratitude and discomfort. Many people were genuinely helped by the ministry she helped build. Many felt comforted by her voice, strengthened by the conversations she hosted, and connected to a larger world of faith through Daystar. At the same time, serious questions remained about wealth, leadership, family conflict, and transparency. A fair telling of her story cannot erase either side. It must hold them together, even when they do not fit comfortably. That is the final truth her life leaves behind. Public legacy is never owned by one person. It is shaped by those who loved you, those who opposed you, those who benefited from your work, those who were hurt by your choices, and those who only knew you through edited moments on a screen. Joni Lamb's legacy will be shaped by Daystar viewers who remember her warmly, by critics who continue asking hard questions, by family members who carry private pain, and by a media culture that keeps turning complex lives into dramatic narratives. None of those voices alone can define her completely. So what really happened to Joni Lamb? The answer may be less shocking than the title suggests, but more heartbreaking. A woman who helped build a powerful Christian media platform lived through immense grief after losing her husband. She tried to continue leading while rebuilding her personal life. Her remarriage brought both support and controversy. Her family relationships became publicly strained. Her health declined after serious struggles, and she died before many questions around her life had been resolved. That is not a simple scandal. It is a human tragedy shaped by fame, faith, money, illness, and unresolved pain. And when the final judgment of her life is considered, perhaps the most honest conclusion is not certainty, but humility. The public saw much, but not all. The cameras captured her image, but not her entire soul. The reports explained parts of her death, but not the full burden of her life. The rumors may continue, but they cannot replace truth. The wealth estimates may circulate, but they cannot measure impact. The controversies may remain, but they cannot erase every moment of comfort she gave to people who believed in her. Joni Lamb's story ends not with a perfect answer, but with a warning. Be careful when turning people into symbols. Be careful when confusing public faith with private peace. Be careful when assuming that a polished life is a painless one. And be careful when demanding complete truth from lives that were never fully visible to begin with. Because behind every platform, every ministry, every fortune, every rumor, and every final headline, there is still a person. Complicated, imperfect, fragile, and far more human than the image the world remembers.